Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today, for being here, and I'd also like to thank the government of Estonia and especially the Ministry of Regional Affairs and Agriculture for the invitation to speak with all of you today. I'd also, in advance, like to thank the interpreters because they're going to have a time keeping up with me. I'm going to speak rather quickly. I will be sharing trends in regional development in OECD and European countries, as well as focusing a lot on some of the governance trends that we're seeing. However, before I do, I'd like to start with setting the scene, and I think that no one is more aware and prepared to understand the pressures that are facing policymakers today than national and sub-national decision makers and administrators. We are seeing and living in a world of increasing pressure, complexity, and change. We've been hearing about that from both of the ministers. Governments are managing diverse back-to-back crises, and these are affecting growth in OECD countries. The OECD Economic Outlook is projecting below-trend growth in 2023 at about 2.6% and growth of about 2.9% in 2024. In addition to this, the energy crisis. And the energy crisis is taking a particularly heavy toll on predominantly rural regions, and I think that's really important here to keep in mind in Estonia, but in other countries as well. Rural areas have less diversified energy mixes and more low-income households, and that is increasing their risk of energy poverty. There are estimates of energy poverty that are showing that about 38% of non-metropolitan regions are already energy poor, and an additional 27% of regions are at risk of this poverty. In general, what we're seeing is that non-metropolitan regions will face an increase in their chance of energy poverty by 35%. Now, a little bit of a silver lining is that subnational finances right now look like they're in pretty good health, but they could deteriorate, so there is a bit of cloudiness on the way. Subnational governments seem to have recovered from the fiscal impact of COVID-19, so that's a good thing. But there are projections of loss in subnational government revenue in OECD countries, and we've been hearing about that just now. But at the same time, central governments are probably not in a position to really come support subnational governments in the future as they have in the past because of their absorption of the fiscal impact of COVID-19, and also they are the ones that are really absorbing a lot of the fiscal impact of inflation today. So, what does this mean for what we're going to be looking at? I'd like to spend some time looking at three trends in regional development, some policy priorities and multi-level governance trends, and it's not here, but thinking a little bit about the future before we enter a conclusion. What all of this between these trends and complexities are showing us is that the current context is calling for countries and regions to boost their ability to think about the future and to grow in their resilience. The three main trends that we will be spending a little bit of time talking about are persistent inequalities, demographic change, and a triple transition. So let me enter into the discussion about inequalities. The first trend in inequalities is, this is going to require a little bit of explanation, trends at the national level of inequality versus the subnational level of inequality. At the left, what we're seeing is that trends at the national level, the majority of countries, you need to look at the column and at the row, the majority of the countries are moving above the OECD mean GDP per capita. That's at a national level if we're comparing countries. There are another large group, and Estonia is in that group, that's converging to an OECD mean GDP per capita. And there's a smaller group that is diverging. But when we start looking at the regional level, we see a lot more differentiation. While some countries may be moving above GDP per capita for OECD, they are still seeing an increase in regional income inequality. fewer are seeing decreases in regional income inequality. And Estonia is in that sort of middle band that you see. So while inequalities between countries or among countries are going down, in many areas, in fact, most, inequalities are increasing among regions. And it looks sort of like this on a regular chart. Basically, in 2022, 70%, 70, of the OECD population was living in countries where regional income inequality is growing. But it's not just a question of economic inequality, not just a question of GDP per capita. These inequalities are also extending into social and service areas. So, for example, in this chart, what we're seeing is that the share of adults with tertiary education in urban areas versus rural areas can be quite significant. The only two countries where it's not too, let's say, doesn't diverge too much are Great Britain and Belgium. In most other countries, the dots are cities, rural areas are the bars. You see a significant divergence, and in Estonia, it's about 19 percentage points. And these regional disparities are also persisting in healthcare. If we're measuring healthcare in terms of hospital beds per 1,000 people, between 2020 and 2021, only large metropolitan areas, let's say 500,000 and above, have grown in the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people. All other areas, be they mid-sized metropolitan areas, cities close to metropolitan areas, places, towns farther and remote, have dropped in their hospital beds per 1,000 people. There is also disparities in access to quality digital infrastructure, and this is going to be important to keep in mind later on. The urban-rural gap in access, if we're measuring fixed internet speed and a percentage deviation for country average, we see that there are differences among cities, just as we see that there are differences among rural areas, but the differences and the inequalities in rural areas are greater in they exist in basically all OECD countries that we've been looking at. And this will become important when we talk about the transition trends. The second trend, and the ministers were discussing this as well, is shrinking populations. And this isn't new. We all know that shrinking populations are facing our regions and our municipalities. But I think what is particularly interesting and important to take away from this graph is that if you look at the short to medium term trend, which are the yellow diamonds, in about half of the OECD countries, if not more, we're showing moderate growth. Some places a little bit more than others. But if we start to look at the long term, from 2021 to 2100, which my mind is having a really hard time getting around to 2100, we're seeing a significant drop in population. In Estonia, the short, medium-term population projection is a drop of 7%. But if we're looking at 2021, it's a drop of 37%. The other thing that's interesting here is that even those countries that are seeing a potential increase in short-term population, so again, the yellow diamonds, may be experiencing a drop in the longer-term future. So we see that, for example, in Chile, Colombia, and Switzerland, for example. We're also seeing metropolitan regions surging ahead, population growth by type of region. From 2000 to 2020, metropolitan areas, as we know, have moved faster. We've seen growth everywhere, but the most is in the metropolitan areas. GDP growth by type of region also has been more significant in metropolitan areas than in other types of communities. At the same time, other regions are shrinking. Remote areas are shrinking the fastest. and then regions near a metropolitan area sort of moderately, but regions far from a metropolitan area are similar to the remote regions. Now, if we look at population levels projected between 2020 and 2040, we see that metropolitan areas are pretty flat. They kind of grow and go down, but it's quite flat, but a significant drop in regions near metropolitan areas and regions far from a metropolitan area. And we're projecting actually a greater drop in the regions that are near a metropolitan area versus those that are far. The third trend, and I'm calling it a triple transition. We have the green transition, which we're all aware of. And the green transition also has its inequalities. Because what we are seeing with the green transition is that metropolitan regions are ahead of all of the other types of regions. They're ahead in terms of their percentage of green task jobs. And not only do they have a higher percentage of green task jobs, but the number of green task jobs are growing compared to other regions. They also have a lower share of polluting jobs, and this share of polluting jobs is at risk of disappearing, depending on how you want to perceive that. There are about a 9 percentage point difference between regions with a low percentage of green task jobs and regions with a high percentage of green task jobs. And so governments are really moving ahead to try to ensure a just and equitable transition. The second transition is the digital transition. And if we think about the digital transition, we can think about it in terms of three components: connectivity, jobs that can be done remotely, and digital skills. There's a 10 percentage point difference in regions with high internet use versus regions with the lowest internet use, on average among OECD countries. But I think we can't think about this just with respect to individuals. We need to think about this also with respect to SMEs, because SMEs are behind larger companies. And if we think about the large differences in the ability of individuals and firms to position themselves in the digital transition, we need to really be thinking about how to overcome that in the future. The third transition is an industrial transition. And here we often are looking at regions and countries that used to be economic drivers for their markets, for their countries, but now are undergoing decline and tend to perform below national average, especially in a variety of areas such as GDP, but also tertiary education and healthcare. These are regions that we really need to pay attention to, and we also need to make sure that other regions do not fall into this trap. And I'll explain why at the end of this presentation. Within this industrial transition, there's a transition in value chains, in global value chains, moving away from being dependent on one or two areas or regions globally for production and expanding that to be more complementary and more synergistic within the value chains. If we take all of this, we can say we are in a period of post-industrial transition with these three different areas. And underlying all of this is innovation. And here, one of the things that I really want to stress is that without innovation, we will not be able to move forward in these transitions. But, and I say this almost everywhere I go, is that innovation cannot be focused only on research and development and technology as innovation. Those cannot be the only types of innovation that are pushed and funded. We need to think about process innovation. We need to think about product and operational innovation. We need to think about social innovation and public sector innovation, because there are many regions and many municipalities and many businesses that are not in a position to support technology and R&D driven innovation. But that doesn't mean they cannot benefit from innovation, and all regions need that. So, what can we do about all of this? The OECD has identified 5 priorities to boost performance in all regions. And this is in our most recent regional outlook. The first priority, or one priority, is ensuring access to key public services and infrastructure. This can be done by improving access and making sure people can access quality services close to where they live, including through digitalized services, and attracting and retaining skilled professionals. Boosting productivity and competitiveness, it seems obvious, it's just not that easy. By supporting regions, the integration of regions into global value chains, by investing in transport and digital infrastructure, and by supporting small and medium cities and towns. Providing the right skills and quality jobs in regional labor markets is also important. Spreading out these opportunities. And this can be accomplished, for example, by providing flexible training, education, and employment services, building up regional entrepreneurial ecosystems, and building the social economy. Strengthening capacity at national and subnational levels is another critical factor. All of these are intertwined. Spending time only on one is not going to be enough. And when we talk about strengthening capacity, it is by investing in subnational fiscal capacity, by investing in institutional capacity, and by building strategic and administrative capacity at the national and the subnational level. And what I'm really going to want to spend some time now on is improving the quality of governance systems and multi-level governance systems, certainly by clarifying responsibilities assigned to different levels of government and by delivering policies and services at the right scale, but really about reconsidering the governance arrangements that help national, municipal, and regional governments move forward in their decision-making. I'm going to skip this slide because of time, and I would like to move to one of the first trends that we are seeing in multi-level governance. As the policy environment grows in its complexity, so does the governance environment. When we speak about multi-level governance, we're really talking about the relationship between the institutions, the frameworks, and the practices that are used by decision makers at all levels of government to make and implement their policies and their services. So make and implement their decisions. And this becomes very important because no level of government can achieve its objectives alone. There is a mutual dependence among levels of government. But what we're seeing is that for many years we've been talking about multi-level governance as national, intermediate, if you have it, and local governments, and that relationship, which tends to be vertical. It's up and down, sometimes it's horizontal, actually it's always horizontal within the blocks. But one of the trends that we're seeing in multi-level governance is that increasingly it's no longer just about these vertical flows, and it's no longer just about governments. It's about the other stakeholders as well. It's about a networked form of government where government is involving the private sector, the third sector, civil society, citizens, and other stakeholders in regional development, strategy, policy, and service decision-making. And about the flows that this creates and the role that these other actors have in the design and the delivery of policy and programs for regional development. What happens here is a networked structure is much more resilient than simply a vertical structure. It's much less brittle. It is more flexible and adaptable. So that is the first trend. I'm going to also skip this slide and move to a second trend, and that is a trend in reinforcing the use of strategic foresight and vision setting in planning. Really what this is about is exploring future changes and their implications in decision making. And really, it's about government and stakeholders thinking today about what can happen tomorrow and what you want tomorrow to look like. About 2/3 of OECD countries have a long-term planning or strategic foresight unit at their center of government, and they use these techniques when they're planning regional development. Canada, France, Switzerland have been very active, so has Australia and Finland. And Estonia is starting to work in this direction as well at the regional level with the OECD, with its pilot regional councils. What strategic foresight helps to do is consider economic, social, and environmental as well as political dimensions and look beyond administrative boundaries to identify different connections that can help shape a region and what is happening in the world that affects that. And it's a tool to reconcile different perspectives and priorities when answering key questions in regional development. So, for example, should we prioritize technological or behavioral change to advance climate objectives? Should we specialize or diversify our economy? Should we develop endogenous resources and skills, or should we really build linkages and partnerships with other neighbors? So taking a very active approach and using foresight in strategic planning is a way to bring people together in that networked governance world to figure out where you want to go as a region, figure out where you want to go as a municipality or even a country, and set a direction for strategic planning. The next trend is an increased focus on implementation. For many years, we've been focusing on strategic planning, and strategic planning is fundamental because it provides a roadmap for joint action towards clear objectives. But it's really important not to forget how to implement and what it takes to implement, because you can have a beautiful strategic plan, and if there's no capacity to implement, you've just wasted a lot of time. So policymakers need to ensure the right conditions for implementation. And what do we mean by this? We mean a clear understanding of who can and should be a part of the implementation with very clear assignments of responsibilities and why they should be taking part in this. Continued leadership and commitment, continued and continuous to achieve the results, but not just political leadership, but administrative leadership as well at all levels of government. Making sure the resources that are necessary are available, financial resources, human resources, and infrastructure resources. But not just government resources. In a networked environment, we also need to be able to think about who can help us that are not part of government, and how can we bring them on board to move things forward, and we'll get into that in a minute. The coordination and the engagement of relevant stakeholders, that whole networked approach and the coordination of this network is very important, and that's why government is almost at the center of that network. Monitoring and evaluation is also fundamental in implementation, but it really needs to no longer be looked at as a control tool. Monitoring and evaluation needs to be thought of as a learning tool and a way to learn how to adjust policy and how to improve what we're doing. A fourth trend is engagement. We're seeing more and more governments at all levels really reconsidering their stakeholder engagement practices, really trying to move beyond a box-ticking exercise and bringing stakeholder engagement into each stage of the public policy cycle. So from the diagnostic all the way through to the monitoring and evaluation. When engagement is done well, it can enhance trust in government, it can support cost-effective policy intervention, identify innovative solutions to difficult and not so difficult problems, and increase ownership and compliance among stakeholders. Remember, our governance world has a lot of stakeholders in it right now. The problem is that a lot of governments do not know how to consult or engage strategically, and a lot of stakeholders don't know how to consult or how to be consulted strategically and how to voice their perspectives. So really, when we're looking at engagement right now, we need to consider why we're engaging, how we're engaging, when we're engaging, with whom we're engaging, and what will happen if we don't engage. We are seeing engagement and governments trying to move closer and closer to the involving, collaborating, and empowering dimension of engagement. And this, we're also seeing engagement be particularly crucial when we think about managing the three transitions I was talking about. And finally, the fifth trend in multi-level governance, which kind of wraps up these other trends, is experimental governance practices. And what do we mean by experimental governance practices and experimentation in governance and policy making? What we mean by experimental is that it is novel and ambitious, and it involves a little bit of risk. Thinking differently when developing strategies and policies. Being collaborative across sectors, among levels of government, and with stakeholders. And that's where that stakeholder engagement dimension comes in. Promoting learning, and learning with each other in that process. And it's circular, because you could start by learning, understanding where you are in order to, through a collaborative process, in order to design a more experimental, novel, and ambitious approach. And this becomes really valuable because it helps build capacity for flexibility and adaptability among policymakers and stakeholders. It builds capacity to act and function in a networked governance environment. It helps policymakers start small, test things out in a particular area for a specific period of time before going large and scaling that up. It can support and advance integrated or cross-sector policy design and helps promote active governance arrangements, including co-production. So it moves you through the spectrum of engagement, as we were seeing before. And while it takes time to see results, it does pay dividends, so it should be viewed as an investment. We're seeing regions testing different policies for example, industrial transition, and seeing very good results. Oops, let me go back. Well, let me go back. Okay, here we go. Just a moment about experimental governance, and I'd like to bring up Estonia in this. The OECD is working with the Ministry for Regional Affairs and Agriculture in an experimental approach to regional development, with experiments in developing regional councils in central and southern Estonia, where it is piloting a new way to approach regional development for competitiveness, growth, and well-being, also using vision setting exercises. So I'm really pleased to see Estonia kind of integrating some of these new trends in multi-level governance and in regional development. Now, thinking about the future, why is this so important? First of all, addressing inequalities and being active in how we manage these, the post-industrial transition, the three transitions, is fundamental because it can help reduce the risk of a geography of discontent and a geography of inequalities. And why is this reduction important? Because a geography of discontent tends to have a high cost in terms of democratic outcomes. What we're seeing in the OECD is that many countries have very wide regional disparities in trust in government. The highest are in Australia and Korea, whereas the lowest seem to be in Sweden and Denmark. And this was in a survey in 2021, 2022. We know that trust in different levels of government vary, and that there tends to be greater trust in government at lower levels of government, regional and local. And in EU member states, there's about a 10% trust in government, in local and regional government is about 10% higher than trust in national governments. But what happens, and what affects trust in government? When there are long-term economic decline, when there are short-term poor labor market outcomes, so basically unemployment, and when people feel that in their regions they do not have access to quality public services like other regions do, and especially in healthcare and education, we see that that affects democratic outcomes. It leads to lower levels of trust and more extreme voting patterns. So there is a democratic quotient that needs to be taken into consideration if we do not address all of the inequalities that we were highlighting earlier in this presentation. It's also a question of creating more resilient regions, and we need to future-proof for that. What do we mean by this? We mean thinking about new forms of mobility. Regions are looking for more, or regions and people are looking for easier access to inexpensive modes of transport, and these new forms of mobility are going to become increasingly important as people start to work more from home, work remotely, or want to work farther from where their company is based. So we're talking about the 15-minute cities, and we were speaking in Estonia about 5-minute cities. productive systems are likely to be transformed, and there are three major trends that we're seeing here. An emergence of Industry 5.0 and large-scale digital and technical transformations in production processes. Development of more circular and low-carbon production and consumption cycles, and a declining and aging labor force, which can change the relationship to work, where people will want to work more remotely, but also may search more for different types of meaning in their work, and that's also going to affect where they live. The advent of place-based and carbon-free energy and food networks. As we have greater energy uncertainty and we see energy prices going up and we're seeing food shortages and food prices going up, we're going to need to reconsider our energy and food strategies, and those are probably going to become more and more localized. So how are regional and local governments going to confront this? There's going to be a shift in the dynamics as well, so we need to keep that in mind in the policy landscape. Also, a shift in land use and a relationship to nature. So land use, we're expecting to see change significantly with a bunch of trade-offs. So, for example, preserving farmland for food production while also needing to develop renewable energy and renewable energy sources. Raising the value of wood resources while strengthening the carbon storage capacity of forests. And at the same time, people's relationship to nature, it seems to be changing. There's a greater value placed not only on nature and preserving nature, but wanting to live closer to nature and having easier access to it. Poverty and new solidarity models are also something that we need to consider and build for more, well, we don't want to build poverty, we want to address poverty for more resilient regions. Basically, these repeated crises, and many of them may not necessarily be going away anytime soon, lead to more people living in precarious conditions. And with increasingly constrained public budgets, governments and civil society and all the actors are going to need to think about new models, mechanisms, and networks of solidarity. And we expect these to emerge as well. So achieving more resilient region is going to require structural transformation, and structural transformation in how regions go, in the supply of energy, in providing essential services, and in how business is done and how land is used. It's going to be important for governments at all levels to be prepared. And to do this, they are going to need to grow in their creativity, in their flexibility, and in their adaptability to the world and to the times we're living in. They are going to need to reconsider their governance structures and their multi-level governance structures, and this is where those trends that I was mentioning are coming in. Because what we are seeing is that traditional approaches to policy making may not be enough. So just in conclusion, some final notes. Regional inequality is not inevitable. It is a difficult challenge, but it is not inevitable. Shrinking and transition, for the moment, appears to be inevitable, but we're constantly transitioning. Addressing today's leading trends should be a political and an administrative priority. And as I shared, the OECD has identified 5 distinct but related policy levers that can help address inequalities. Multi-level governance arrangements are fundamental. It's really important to think about these because these are what support your decision-making. And managing the future is going to require reconsidering the present. We can't really continue to act the way we've been acting, and we cannot continue to make policy in the same way. We need to rethink it. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but be innovative and be experimental in how you're designing and implementing your policy. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a few questions. So you did mention that there are certain inevitable trends. Nevertheless, latest numbers and papers show a loss of population in metropolitans and growth in medium-sized and nice amenity-rich cities. In your opinion, is this a new trend or simply a temporary fluctuation?
I think it's an interesting, I think it's actually quite interesting. And I am wondering if it's still sort of a post-COVID, part of a post-COVID trend where people are, even in medium-sized cities, kind of wanting to go outward. I would venture to say it's cyclical. We see over time, you know, people leave urban areas, even medium-sized urban areas. They may go to the metropolitan areas. They may go to more rural areas. I don't know because we don't have enough time scale to see what's happening in this trend. I can't give you a definitive answer.
So is there any point in trying to fight this growth of metropolitans, or should we simply let it go, see it as an inevitable trend, and cope with it?
No, I actually don't agree with that. This is my personal opinion, but I think at the OECD also, we're really trying to help medium and small-sized cities and different types of rural areas that are close to cities and rural areas that are remote. Continue to grow. I think that we can't, first of all, you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket, and just focusing on metropolitan areas is putting all of your eggs in one basket. But people need to be able to choose where they live. Not everyone wants to live in a metropolitan area. Not everyone wants to live in a large city. And some people really do want to live in rural or more remote areas or smaller cities. And that has to be respected and worked with. So no, I don't think that just giving up on more remote places is the way to go. I think that's one of the challenges that policymakers need to grapple with and find solutions for, which is what we were trying to do with those 5 policy priority areas.
Speaking of this multi-level model, who should be controlling and guiding the development of local municipalities? Who's responsible? Because we know when the responsibility is dispensed between participants, that could be a threat.
I think it's a national and a subnational responsibility. I think that for many years or decades, municipalities were considered to not have capacity to manage their own growth. And that has affected a really place-based approach to regional and local development. I think municipalities and regions really do understand what their needs are and what they're capable of. At the same time, they cannot do it alone. It's not fair for a national government to say, okay, go at it yourself, take care of yourself. It's like, I don't know, telling a child or a teenager, go take care of yourself. It's not appropriate and it's not just. So there is a need to build the capacity of subnational governments fiscally in terms of human resources and in terms of their infrastructure to be able to move forward. And we have an example, I think the most relevant example right now actually comes from Ukraine. Before the war, Ukraine undertook a very, very significant reform of its subnational government. And we were working with them before the war to identify what the impact of their decentralization reforms and regional development reforms had been on municipalities. And one of the things that we found, so we ended up sending out a survey to all 1,489, maybe 79, but I think it's 89 municipalities in Ukraine, and had a response rate of over 50%. And all of them indicated that decentralization reforms and a more place-based approach to development had increased their capacity as municipalities for management, for their budgets, and for their planning. So It is a joint effort between national and subnational governments to allow municipalities and regions to flourish and to give them the ability to do so.
Ladies and gentlemen, Varinia, Michalun, thank you very much.